Perfect. Well, good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining. We're going to jump into the content today. So we're going to focus on difficult conversations. And this is probably a topic that no one really likes to have these conversations. They're hard to do. A lot of emotions and feelings probably bubble up. But they happen at work, they happen in our personal lives, they happen all of the time. So my goal today is really to provide you with some tools, some tricks, some templates to make it easier. There still might be some emotions that pop up when you have to have these conversations, but going through some of these tools and templates and tricks and tips will really help you structure these conversations going forward. So that's what we're planning on covering today. And we'll really focus on why are the conversations so difficult. Then we're going to shift gears and jump into the 3 structures of difficult conversations. And this is all based off the book, Difficult Conversations. If you haven't read it, it's a really good one to jump into. Then we'll wrap up with some guidelines and some tips and tricks. And I'd love to hear from you around things that you've done to hold difficult conversations as well. Boundary setting, yeah, that's a great one. The ones where you know the outcome might be negative. Yep. What about feedback? Can feedback be difficult? When you've got to give that constructive feedback, it can be challenging. Usually you're trying to help someone out, make things better, but still there's a lot of emotions and feelings. Contentious topics, yeah.
I think the thing I find difficult is I just tend to be kind of a people pleaser, and I have a hard time. I don't want to upset anybody or hurt anybody's feelings, even if it's feedback that needs to be given.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great one. Thanks, Jessica. Um, Becky also doesn't like having people mad at them. I don't either. I mean, a lot of when feelings and emotions get involved, that's what makes conversations difficult. And what's funny is that these conversations, it doesn't have to be just around the negative things or providing that constructive feedback. Sometimes giving the positive feedback or taking that feedback can be a difficult conversation as well. So it doesn't just focus on the negative. We typically think of it in that space. And it tends to be where it is the hardest for us to have those conversations, but they're really difficult because of the way that we approach them. And I'm going to share with you some ways to think about approaching them differently so our emotions aren't really driving the conversation. No matter what we do to plan, the conversation probably will not go as planned because other people's emotions are going to come in as well. But if you practice and you work through some of these tips and tricks, it will make having the conversation a lot easier in the long run. And then one more kind of poll or chat question for you all. I'd love for you to guess the number. So what percentage of employees, and this is from Braverly, a startup, do they say are avoiding difficult conversations with either their boss, direct reports, or their peers? So it is 70%. When I saw this number, I was like, that makes sense to me. I know in the past, I've definitely avoided these conversations. I've thought to myself, I'll wait till it happens next time, then I'll bring it up. That was just kind of a cop out to say, like, I'm not having this conversation. It's challenging and no one wants to hurt anyone else's feelings, but these tips and tricks I'm going to share today should hopefully make it a little bit easier. So let's shift gears and start to look at the book, Difficult Conversations. Doing their research, the book's written by Douglas Stone, Bruce Patton, and Sheila Heen. They wrote this book. It's been around for a long time. It's one that gets pushed out in the business world a lot. I highly recommend it. But when they were doing their research on all of these difficult conversations, they were finding that there were 3 basic structures that they all followed, and that in these 3 basic structures, people were making mistakes, and that's where it got so difficult. So the first conversation is the what happened conversation. Then there's the feelings conversation and the identity conversation. When you're having that difficult conversation, all of these 3 pieces are happening in that conversation. So when we look at the what happened conversation, this is really all about who's right and who's wrong. In this conversation, we usually confuse intention with impact. And that's where people get really upset because we think someone intended to hurt us. We blame that other person for the issues, and then we start to think of ourselves as the victims, or the person you're having that conversation with is doing that as well. So in any difficult conversation, really no one person is to blame. They come up when two people both have contributed to the conversation and they're doing something to make it more difficult. There's some exceptions to this rule, but in general, when two people's choices and beliefs clash, that's when those difficult conversations are going to come up. And according to the Difficult Conversations book, something that they found that can kind of help you change your mindset and how you're operating is to think through the contribution system. The contribution system helps us focus on the ways we might have contributed to the issue. So we're really going to take a step back and think about, what did I do in this situation? And really start to look at the facts and not our feelings. A lot of times when you're in these conversations, people get defensive. And when someone gets defensive, when you're talking to them, you're probably going to get defensive back with them. So if you can start to think about, how did I contribute to this conversation, and own some of those mistakes, and then work through it with them and get them to talk through like what they may have done and take some responsibility for the action, that's going to really help the conversation run more smoothly. You're still going to talk about the tough stuff. You're still going to probably bubble up some uncomfortable things. But if you can start to own some of that and take it on, the conversation will be a lot better. The next piece is the feelings conversation. And this is what most people think about with difficult conversations, because the feelings come into play. Nobody wants to hurt someone else's feelings. We get that yucky feeling in our stomach when we have to have those tough conversations. And most of us will enter these difficult conversations oblivious to our own feelings, because maybe we've suppressed like how we're feeling, or we're not recognizing those feelings. We're also convinced that we shouldn't bring our feelings into the conversation. We really want to stick to the facts, or we're convinced that our feelings are the ones that matter and not the other person's. So what we want to do here is really make sure that we're thinking about our own emotional footprint. And what I mean by that is, this is how we handle emotions. And it's usually based upon how you grew up and how your family handled it. Did you grow up in a household where you clearly expressed emotions and said it was okay to be sad, mad, angry? Or did you not talk about that? And were you told, we don't cry at that, we shut those feelings down? So the way you grew up can impact the way that you handle emotions in the future. So the big step here is to realize that all emotions are acceptable, but we can learn how to handle them in the situation. So you may have to spend some time thinking through your emotions. What is really making you get fired up or want to have this difficult conversation? And then identify them, identify those emotions, kind of see when they pop up. Is it one person who just triggers those emotions for you because of an interaction you've had? Is it certain words or phrases that people use? What is that thing that's making those feelings happen? And then when those triggers happen, start to take a step back, process through, and think through, what can I do differently to handle these emotions? And finally, the third step is the identity conversation. So this probably plays pretty large for a lot of people as well. In a bad conversation or a difficult conversation, we really look at our identity as it's all or nothing. So for example, if we hurt someone, we're a bad person. Or if we're a good person and the other person's, complaints aren't valid, we'll kind of shoot down what they're bringing up. So the identity conversation typically focuses on three things. The first is, am I competent? Am I a good person? And am I worthy of love? In difficult conversations, you're worried that the answer to all of these questions is no. So the way to kind of shift your mindset and move out of this identity where you're taking it all on is to adopt the and stance. This approach allows you to identify and acknowledge the complexity and embrace the contradictions. So what I mean by that is, you could say you're a good person and you hurt someone's feelings. So overall, you are a good person, but in this interaction, you ended up hurting that person's feelings, and now you need to own up and have that conversation. Or maybe it's, you're competent and you made a mistake this time. You're a good boss and you have to fire a long-term employee. Those are some of the places that those difficult conversations can come up. So when you add that and stance, you're starting to remove a little bit of the identity and you're breaking up that all or nothing idea. It can make it a little bit easier. Guidelines for difficult conversations. And in here, I really want us to start thinking through some things that we can do a little differently when we're having the conversation. So it might be the ways we prep, we prepare, we think through holding these conversations, or ways to get us to stop avoiding from having them. So you've all probably heard that there are three sides to every story: your side, their side, and what happened. If you approach the conversation with curiosity, you're going to start thinking about things differently. So instead of going in with the what happened conversation and thinking that I'm right, they're wrong, be curious, ask questions, really dig deep and find out what's the other person's side of the story. How did they interpret the events that occurred? What do they view your contributions as, and what would improve the situation? I'm going to share with you a model that's going to really help you get through these steps, but it's always good to approach any difficult or challenging conversation with curiosity. You want to have that open mindset, be open, dig deeper. And then you want to separate intention from impact. This is one of my absolute favorite quotes because I think it is so true. So Stephen Covey said, "We judge ourselves by our intentions and others by their actions." So we might have hurt someone's feelings, but that was not our intention. So we don't put the blame on ourselves. We don't say that we did that. But if somebody else did something to hurt our feelings, we're automatically going to judge them by that. We're not holding ourselves to that same standard. So those actions from other people are really going to make you feel a certain way depending on those past experiences and emotional baggage. When you get hurt or upset, the first impulse is to assume that the other person meant to make you feel that way. It's rarely the case. They probably did not intend to do that. A lot of times those difficult feedback conversations are coming up because someone really truly wants to help you improve, but they may not have used the right words or phrases to have it resonate with you. So I love this because you really want to think through when you're having that conversation, what's your intent and what actions have you shown, and think through what actions did you see from someone else, and can you start to assume positive intent? You know, in this virtual world, we don't get to see people in passing. We're doing most of our communication through Slack and through email. We do have a lot of Zoom meetings, but not everybody shares their cameras, so you don't always get to see body language. You're not getting those responses that you may see if you were in person and having that conversation. So remember that when you jump into this. We also want to make sure that we're a good listener. This is one of the most common complaints that Patton, Stone, and Heeden heard while researching their book. There was always one person's not listening. And we need to get better at listening if we expect others to listen to us. So what are some things you think we all can do to be better listeners, especially in this virtual environment and you're doing this difficult conversation over Zoom or over a Slack video call? What are some things you think you can do to be a better listener? You know, ask questions with the goal of learning. So you want to clarify, and that ties into what Emma said about paraphrasing their responses. So what I thought you heard, or if I heard you correctly, or you said it this way, is this what you meant? That's a way that you can really make sure you're both on the same page. And then it's also really important to acknowledge their feelings. And Kathy chimed in with listen to hear, not to respond. I love that too. That's a great way to think about this as well. So thinking through it, there's a lot of things that we can do because as humans, we kind of want to jump in and solve the problem. Or if you're giving that feedback and having that difficult conversation, you might have a solution in mind, but there might be another way to do it. And we want to listen to that person to make sure we understand what they're thinking, feeling as well. So as you jump into these conversations going forward, just pay attention to how you're listening. See if you're getting distracted. See if you're starting to think through things differently and you're trying to come up with those different answers. Some other additional tips and tricks are to start with safe topics and safe people. So what I mean here is that if you have to have a difficult conversation, pull in someone that's not involved in that issue, that you think is a safe person, that probably has a different viewpoint than you or a different way of going about things. They probably communicate a little differently, and practice with them first. Run it by them, talk it through with them, get their feedback. How would they feel if they were on the other end of this conversation? Then the more you practice, the more you're going to build your confidence. So the more you do this, the easier it will get. It's never going to be the easiest thing you ever do, because we all have feelings and we all care about others. But the more you practice this and think through it, it will be a little bit easier to do this, and it will develop your confidence in having these conversations. And then after you start with those safe people and practice a little bit, really start targeting those more difficult conversations that you need to have. And then finally, learn from your experiences and unpack them. And we'll wrap up with that before we tie up the session. Some other tips that you want to think through is, these conversations are not going to go according to plan. You can sit down, script it out, write it all out, think this is what I'm going to say, this is what's going to happen. And you don't know if that other person is going to get defensive, if they're going to cry, if they're going to shut down, if they're going to hang up on you because they're not in the right space. Practicing is really good because it will get you to think through using the right words and phrases, but just know it's never going to go according to plan, and that's okay. Don't wait too long. This is probably the biggest thing I see happening. We avoid it. We don't want to talk about it. We don't want to address it because we think maybe someone else will do it, or I'll just wait till it happens again. And then we never do it. This is really a way to kind of get into a cop out and not do it. Make sure that you're having that conversation shortly after the issue comes up. Now, sometimes it's really hard to do in that moment, and we're not together, so we don't see each other in passing. And I know for you and the Ibotta care side, you don't get that interaction. You're normally doing a lot of things virtually. So I'd encourage you all to not wait too long, turn on your cameras. Don't have it over a chat, because you're not getting the body language. You're interpreting tone through email, through Slack, and things like that. And a lot of times we avoid it because it just feels awkward. So make sure we're setting the right tone, that we're intentional about it, that we're coming in with a positive outcome. It's more along the lines of, if I were in your shoes, I would want someone to share this feedback with me. Because a lot of times people are blind to what's going on, especially if no one has given them that feedback. So if you can set it up and set the tone appropriately, where you're kind of going in with some humility. Maybe you're talking a little tentatively. You're not talking about everything with just the facts and this is the way it was. You're creating a little bit of compassion in the conversation. It might open it up so others are able to jump in and participate as well. And then finally, use I statements. So this is something that, people have probably heard many times, but when you are in a conversation, and especially if it starts to get heated, state that I feel this way when you do that. Maybe that's more of a personal thing, or it could be a work experience. I feel undermined when you don't let me take ownership of X, Y, and Z. So using those I statements, like I feel, I see, I've noticed, that's kind of bringing it back on you instead of saying, you always do this, you're wrong. That's where people will start to get defensive. Assume positive intent is my motto for 2020. I think we all have to embrace it. If you've probably heard me say that in some different sessions. I've always been a big fan of that phrase, but I feel like in this world, there's a lot going on right now, and people may be dealing with things outside of the work stuff that we have no idea what's happening. So it's great to assume positive intent. Awesome. I have one more model to share with you. I wanted to hear what you all had to say, and this comes from the book Crucial Conversations. So there's crucial conversations, there's crucial confrontations, there's difficult conversations. All three of these books have been around for a little while, and they've all have some great tools that you can leverage. And another tool from this book that I really love is the STATE model. The STATE model stands for share your facts, tell your story, ask for the other's path, talk tentatively, and encourage testing. Now, we've touched upon a few of these these 5 things in here, but the first 3 are really what do you need to do, and the last 2 are how you do it. So with the share your facts, you want to start the conversation where you're stating the facts, not your story. So it's really important when you're planning that you start to separate facts and the story. We might make up a story in our head that, someone was late for the meeting, they didn't care about it, and then it becomes, well, they're always late. So we're kind of converting that into a story. The first time you tend to see or hear something, you're making up a story. You're kind of climbing that ladder of inference. Catch yourself if you're making up those stories and really start to think about what are the facts, what happened here, because that will make the conversation easier. Stories are not facts, they're assumptions. And the facts are less controversial because you can clearly say in this email, you said, in your response to, or I witnessed you do X, Y, and Z, that's a fact versus I heard, or other things like that, kind of jumping to those conclusions. When you tell your story, this is where you can share your assumptions. So start with your facts, and then some of those assumptions and stories will come up. So you might see the person get a little defensive here when you start to kind of explain what happened through your story. If that happens, find mutual purpose. You're both there to kind of resolve this. You're having this conversation to improve the working relationship, to continue to do things so you don't stumble again. Really make sure that you're saying what you don't mean and what you do mean. So you might have said something that came across and it got picked up a different way. And you can say, when I said this, it seems that you interpreted it to mean that. I did not mean that. What I was trying to say was this, and I didn't handle it appropriately. That's kind of giving that story and that mutual purpose. So you need to talk through all of that. And then kind of pause and ask for the other's path. So this is where you let them share their story, let them share their facts. So you're going to start to see what are those common facts and where are you both making up those stories in your head. And that's probably where the tension and the conflict came from. Again, we talked about this. Don't interrupt them. You really want to listen. And then you can dig deeper. So maybe if they're not open to sharing their story or their path, what are your thoughts? How did you see it? Because if you shared, this is how I saw the situation. What do you think happened? How did you see it? Then you'll get their perspective and, you can clearly ask, what is your perspective here? And then talk tentatively. I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but this is when you're sharing your story. Remember that it's an assumption, not a fact. Don't state it like you might with a fact. Share it tentatively. Share it as a possibility. It's not something that certainly happened, because you may find out in this conversation you were jumping to assumptions and those assumptions were wrong. And then after that, encourage testing. So we were chatting a little bit about this, like what would they do in this situation? What do you think the next steps are? They might come up with some of those other ideas. And this is where maybe both of you can play devil's advocate. You've kind of gotten everything out there. Well, what if it happened this way? Well, what if we think about it that way? What could we do differently going forward just to continue upon the relationship? And once you have that hard conversation, it usually opens up the feedback channel if you do it well. So plan for it, prep for it, know that it's not going to go according to plan. But if you think through the words, the phrases, how you say things, that you truly listen, you'll have a better conversation with everyone. Then Jessica, I'm just seeing your note in the chat right now. So how do you prompt someone who is completely shut down during a conversation to be more productive? The shutdown one is hard because you're probably not going to bring them out of that in the moment. I would follow up and say, I just shared a lot of information with you, and I know you're probably processing it. If you need some time to think through this, I'd love to talk to you more, because my intent is to fix our relationship, to continue to work more collaboratively together, whatever your goal is there, and be like, I'd love for you to spend some time to like think through your side of the story and what happened, and have an open dialogue with me. They may never come back to you to do that. That's the hard part. But positioning it that way, letting them know that you want to hear what they have to say and what's important, might open up the door. If they've already shut down, they might also jump into that blame game. I didn't do it because I didn't get the info from so-and-so on time, or it's somebody else's fault, it's not my fault. Then I'd encourage them to kind of think through, what could they have done to make sure we've gotten the info on time? What was their piece of ownership here? And then acknowledge, you know what, you didn't do everything, and that's why we're talking through this. We want to fix whatever the issue is, and if we need to pull in that person for a separate conversation, we can do that as well. Does that help, Jessica?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Yeah, the shutdown, or even like if you have the conversation and someone kind of leaves it with the thanks, okay, fine, you don't always really know if they heard you. So I would, especially if you're someone's manager, and that was the response you've gotten from them, I'd give it a week or so, like let it calm, but, just check in with them and see if they're still kind of in that defensive mode. Are they still shutting down? They may never come back and like admit that they were truly wrong, but emotions are going to happen in these conversations. So it's okay to give people that space if they need it. Just make sure you follow up to continue to have the conversation, and go with it from that stance of, I want things to be productive. I want things to improve. So then once you've had that conversation, you could do this with the other person, or you could do this as your own personal reflection, but really think through what went well. What did I say or do? What did they say or do? What went well in the conversation? What would you do differently? Maybe you use some words or phrases that you shouldn't have used, and they just came out because the conversation went differently than you had planned. But this will help you think through the next time you have to have a difficult conversation, what can you do differently? And then what did you learn? What were the things that you learned from that conversation? What did you learn about the person? What did you learn about the assumptions that you might have made? And then what questions do you still have? Because maybe there are things that you both still need to talk through that might not have fully been resolved, or weren't a question at the time of the conversation, but are still kind of burning in the back of your head. It's like, oh man, I wish we talked about this, or I'm unsure about this. You can go back and kind of have that constructive conversation again. Thank them for their time as well. That will help kind of wrap it up nicely, because it's important to have those difficult conversations. So what I want you all to do is, the next time you have to have a difficult conversation, make sure you're not putting it off, that you're doing it in a timely manner, but leverage some of the tips and tricks that you've learned in this session. Find an accountability partner, like someone that you trust. If it feels a little safer to practice it, or have a conversation that's more of a personal conversation than a work conversation, that could be a great place to practice this. Maybe there's something your spouse, significant other, partner are doing that's driving you crazy. You can practice some of these steps and see if that changes the conversation, or friend, family member, whatever. Sometimes it's a little easier, but sometimes our emotions bubble up in that instance differently than we do when we're talking to our parents or friends, family. And then some resources, definitely the Difficult Conversations book. There's lots of summaries online that you can dig into and pull up. You've gotten kind of the crash course syllabus today. A few other articles that I found that were quick to read that could always be good to share with your teams are the Taking the Stress Out of Stressful Conversations from Harvard Business Review. And then Most People Handle Difficult Conversations by Ignoring Them. It's an Inc. article. These would be great things to like share with your team members, have conversations around, get them thinking through it. Awesome. Well, I hope this was helpful. I know they're not easy conversations. But if you start to implement a few of these tips, it may make them go a little smoother in the long run. Remember, emotions are going to happen. Don't get defensive back with that other person, and continue to practice this and hold them in a timely manner. That's probably the first step we all can take, that we follow up and have those conversations. Thanks, everybody. It's so nice to see you all. I hope you have a great rest of your Thursday, and I'll see you all next time. Bye, everyone.